And I want to thank Mary and Debbie and Kirk and all the others who made this conference possible. I don't want to get too involved in expounding the significance of national park roads, of roads to national park experience, which is the subject of a book that you got an announcement about that's going to be coming out this summer. And if I go off on that, I'll be on a 2-hour tangent. But just to put things in terms of this morning's presentation, I'll just say that I'll see Easton's bid on traditional landscape park design and raise him a stack of pleasure roads, which, if you notice, was what Olmsted was actually talking about in that letter to Charles Eliot that he quoted. And perhaps Sierra Club leader Harold Bradley said it best when he noted in 1950 that park roads determine park history. Park road preservation is one of the most contentious issues facing National Park Service cultural resource managers today. From Glacier and Yellowstone to Blue Ridge Parkway and myriad other units, historical values have been threatened by calls to upgrade old roads to new standards. Most of these efforts entail well-intentioned attempts to make roads safer and more efficient by easing curves, widening road beds, and constructing stronger and longer guard walls. While these standard engineering solutions may be appropriate in many non-park situations, they can compromise the scenic beauty and historic integrity of national park roads designed in different eras and for different purposes. Disagreements over the degree to which park roads should be upgraded have created conflicts between NPS personnel, federal engineers, and stakeholders ranging from environmentalists and historic preservationists to gateway communities and motorists themselves. Given the enormous role roads play in shaping the visitor's experience and influencing the broader course of park development, discussions about appropriate levels of improvement are not matters of tactical and aesthetic hair splitting, but debates about the nature and purpose of national parks. This presentation will trace the rising interest in historic road preservation, highlighting key projects such as the rehabilitation of Yellowstone's Grand Loop Road and Glacier's Going to the Sun Road. We'll also explore some of the roots of national park road preservation, demonstrating that efforts to commemorate and conserve park roads began much earlier than is generally realized and played a vital role in some of the most significant episodes in NPS history. In order to appreciate these early iterations, it's necessary to expand one's perception of historic preservation, since they rarely involved self-identified preservationists or invoked contemporary terminology. Throughout most of national park history, concerns about preserving the historic qualities of park roads were expressed by landscape architects, park superintendents, environmental advocates, and yes, even engineers. The current emphasis on cataloging and curating individual features is also absent. With notable exceptions, those we might now categorize as preservationists spoke in general terms about the need to protect the unique character of the park road experience, which was predicated on the leisurely enjoyment of natural scenery. Many policy directives and design practices cited as evidence of the NPS's embrace of landscape architecture, I think it could just as easily be seen as efforts to retain the historical character of reconstructed roads and ensure that new roads conform to historical ideals. While the scope and sophistication of recent efforts might give the impression that the reverence for park roads is a new phenomenon, the recognition that park roads were historic achievements possessing unique qualities worthy of commemoration and preservation is almost as old as the national park idea itself. Pioneering Yellowstone Superintendent Nathaniel Langford and noted landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted emphasized the importance of roads in making the national parks fulfill their designated functions. While Olmsted's injunction to preserve the Yosemite scenery is endlessly cited, he was equally adamant about the need for better access. Without improving the dismal stage roads to the valley rim and extending them down into the heart of the park, he maintained, visitors would be too exhausted to benefit from the uplifting exposure to Yosemite scenery. Langford was equally adamant. Having created the park for the benefit and the enjoyment of the people, the federal government was obligated to ensure the public could experience it with a reasonable degree of safety and comfort. Railroad companies and others who sought to reap the financial rewards of park creation also clamored for improvements, as did the slowly growing stream of tourists who braved dangerous bridle paths and other trying conditions to visit the remote wonderlands. And in case you're under the impression that park travel was accident-free before the days of the automobile, look at the equine casualty in the bottom of the right there. Progress came slowly, hampered by meager funding, challenging conditions, and primitive technology. Since the National Park Service did not exist until 1916, the first national park roads were constructed by private entrepreneurs and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Construction crews labored with picks, shovels, and horse-drawn equipment to carve rudimentary roadbeds out of steep mountainsides. Black powder was used to blast away the worst obstacles, but road builders followed the dictates of the terrain, zigzagging up slopes with dramatic switchbacks and hazardous hairpin turns. Despite these challenges, park road builders accomplished impressive feats. In Yellowstone, the Army Corps of Engineers constructed several entrance roads and completed the circuit linking the park's major features. Between 1883 and 1905, they built or improved approximately 300 miles of roadway, along with several impressive bridges. I don't know if you can read this or not, but note how this turn-of-the-century tourism brochure not only praises the view from the road, but observes that the work constituted a very fine piece of engineering and entailed a tremendously heavy expenditure by the federal government. In Yosemite, which was initially administered by the state of California, private toll roads provided the first vehicular access. During the 1870s, rival concerns from outlying communities constructed the stage roads that replaced the hazardous trails leading to the valley floor. The completion of these roadways was greeted with grand celebrations, replete with brass bands, fireworks, and ample libations. Along with improving access, these roads afforded impressive examples of road building, such as the Big Oak Flat Road zigzag turn, which was as viscerally thrilling as it was visually stunning, embodying contemporary enthusiasm for the union of the natural and technological sublime. A mountaineer, the Army Corps of Engineers built the Nisqually Road between 1900 and 1910, upgrading the existing toll road and extending it to the alluring meadows of Paradise Valley. The Corps also constructed some of the first roads at Crater Lake and eventually assumed control of road building in Yosemite. Not only did these roads provide access to America's western wonderlands, but they established precedents for the development, use, and public perception of parks that influenced MPS policies throughout the 20th century and continue to resonate today. Long before the first automobile chugged and wheezed its way into Yosemite's vaunted valley, these minimalistic wagon tracks firmly established the expectation that the national park experience was primarily a park road experience, where vehicular travel through attractive scenery was punctuated with brief pauses as its signature attractions and iconic vistas, such as Yosemite's Inspiration Point, where tourists got their first glimpse of the monumental valley. And while this might offend latter-day critics, 19th century visitors would have expected nothing less, as Ethan described, given the dominant roles played in municipal parks and the enjoyment of eastern tourist destinations, another factor that doesn't get brought up as much. Not only did the Yellowstone's Grand Loop exemplify the adaptation of traditional park development to the national park setting, but the identification of the park with its transportation infrastructure was so strong that roads and stagecoaches vied with geysers and bears as icons of the park experience. As primitive trails and crude lodgings gave way to graded roads and elaborate hotels, the stagecoach tour was celebrated as an attraction in its own right. Writers recounted the trip in elaborate detail, regaling readers with the rigors and rewards of stagecoach travel. Road-related images appeared on a wide range of souvenirs, such as the stereo views, spoons, postcards, and ceramics visitors purchased to preserve their memories of the park. Yosemite's tunnel trees and Wamona Road's Inspiration Point afforded similar juxtapositions of natural and man-made wonders, which were memorialized in postcards, stereo views, and other talismans of the park experience. Now, characterizing these mementos as preservation might seem like a stretch, but by canonizing key features and establishing a tradition of veneration, they underscored the centrality of roads to the park experience and laid the groundwork for the subsequent preservation efforts. And as Ethan also noticed, public history and public memory are becoming more entwined with physical historic preservation these days. The Golden Gate Viaduct generated what might be considered the first clash between engineering standards and preservationist sentiments. In 1884, construction crews under Lieutenant Daniel Kingman encountered an opposing cliff at the crux of the climb through a dramatic cleft known as the Golden Gate. Since blasting a passage across the rock face would have been inordinately expensive, Kingman constructed wooden trestles supporting a 16-foot wide deck. At the lower end, workmen discovered a stone pillar split off from the mountain, from the main outcrop. Kingman's pragmatic advice as an engineer was to send it crashing into the canyon. But Yellowstone's assistant superintendent suggested tourists might enjoy this picturesque feature. A narrow passageway was excavated to provide a seemingly natural gateway, just wide enough for one coach to pass. Even at stagecoach speeds, the stone stub posed a clear danger, but tourist and guidebook writers quickly embraced it as a signature element of the Yellowstone tour. As stagecoach traffic became heavier and tourists less adventurous, Kingman's successor, Hiram Chittenden, faced a similar dilemma, noting that the trestle maintained structurally sound, but its precarious appearance generated what he diplomatically described as uneasiness and concern among the traveling public. Chittenden set about replacing it with a wider and more substantial concrete viaduct. Questions arose about the fate of the stone column, which was now not just a picturesque embellishment, but a celebrated aspect of the Yellowstone experience. With the wider roadbed and altered grade, the obstructed pillar was even a greater affront to engineering expectations. But Chittenden also initially insisted that safety and efficiency should trump what he called sentimentalism. But park photographer F.J. Haynes convinced him the public would lament the landmark's loss. Preserving the pillar was an engineering achievement in its own right. The 23-ton monolith was jacked up 6 feet to meet the new grade and shifted 6 feet sideways, where it rested on a stout concrete column. These efforts were carefully concealed so tourists could continue to marvel at the propitious location of this natural gateway. And when thinking about the role of roads, the awareness of the role of roads, here's a stereo view of construction of the Chittenden Viaduct, showing it under construction. Similar sleights of hands occurred when the structure was widened and strengthened in 1933 and again in 1977, by which time the pillar was so firmly ensconced in Yellowstone lore that there was no question about its preservation. Despite his hesitation about the Golden Gate Pillar, Chittenden was an early advocate of what we now characterize as flexibility in highway design and context-sensitive solutions, key concepts for contemporary preservationists. While he embraced and expanded on existing guidelines for park road development, he maintained that deviations were permissible to avoid compromising important features. His signature bridge above Yellowstone's Upper Falls fell 1.5 feet short of the reigning standards, which he excused by the need for delicacy in the highly picturesque setting. Noting the folly of attempting to widen and straighten the road through a series of outcrops known as the hoodoos, he insisted that stage drivers should alter their behavior instead. It would be better to require all teams to come to a walk there, he pronounced, than to remedy the defect by blasting out those picturesque rocks. Most visitors hailed the engineer's achievements, but as early as 1894, Chittenden noticed that an occasional crank lamented the impact of improved roads. While they acknowledged the need for basic access, critics complained that additional development would, quote, convert the grand domain from the wild state in which nature gave it to man to a crowded summer resort. Presaging the sentiments of 20th century opponents, they insisted the government should leave things as they were because further enhancements would attract a horde of the idle curious whom it would be better to keep away. You can't drive quite so close these days. The advent of automobile tourism generated widespread support for the improvement of park roads. Between the popular insistence on making parks accessible to automobiles and the newly formed National Park Service's belief that catering to the motoring public was both a civic duty and a means of generating support for the protection and expansion of the park system, there was no question that outdated wagon tracks would be updated to accommodate America's newest national pastime. NPS leaders joined the auto clubs, tourism interests, and outraged motorists, insisting that dangerous, narrowly steep and tortuous roads be improved to promote access and enhance safety. The biggest question, how to pay for system-wide improvements, was answered in 1924 with the passage of a 3-year, $7.5 million funding bill, followed by an even more generous multi-year allotment and the munificence of FDR's New Deal. While the NPS gained rapid renown for its landscape architecture expertise, there were considerable questions about its engineering capabilities. NPS Director Stephen Mather had doubts about the abilities of his irascible chief George Goodwin, and the growing scope and complexity of the park road construction through the agency coming in stark relief. I like the body language in this 1921 photograph that shows a worn-down looking Mather, chief landscape architect kind of blending into the background on the left, and Goodwin standing imperiously at the center. He really felt he was, that jawed man in there. And I think that's a young Ethan Carr on the right. Doesn't there kind of a, I just saw that. Assessing an opportunity to expand his own agency's influence, BPR Chief Thomas McDonald, Bureau of Public Roads Chief Thomas McDonald, put heavy pressure on Mather to transfer engineering responsibilities to the BPR. While the ensuing 1926 Memorandum of Agreement has long been heralded as a model collaboration, NPS officials had deep reservations about the partnership, many of which presage contemporary conflicts between the two agencies. Goodwin and Horace Albright cautioned that the BPR's insistence on the rigid application of higher standards was inconsistent with the preservation of park road values. The excessive widening, grading, and straightening would destroy the charm of existing roads and cause undue damage in the construction of new ones. I don't know if you can see either, but the NPS road widths on the bottom left are not only much narrower, but they're explicitly flexible, 8 to 16 feet, to accommodate the different conditions. The BPR's decision to cut down a 40-year-old sugar pine on the approach to California's Calaveras Big Tree Grove outside of the park underscored the danger and further eluded the distinction between natural and historic preservation. This was a brilliant piece of propaganda. Mather brought journalists to this spot. That's actually a picture of him. There are photographs of this trip where he's generating support to keep engineers at bay. Criticizing one of the earliest collaborative efforts, NPS landscape architect Daniel Hull characterized the BPR's attempt to upgrade Yosemite's El Portal Road as an example of standardization run riot and prepared a detailed account of the transgressions. In the narrow-minded pursuit of what he called a so-called better alignment, BPR engineers ignored NPS directives to preserve the unfolding trees and outcrops that contribute to the roadway's picturesque appeal. The very charm the tourist seeks may be destroyed by holding too strongly to standard specifications, he admonished, insisting that park roads improvements should not be governed by engineering concerns alone. Hall also criticized the BPR's blasting techniques and the way it let contractors leave rocks and other construction debris scattered along the roadside. And if you've ever wondered about the NPS seeming fixation with borrow pit regulations, on the upper right, you can see the kind of thing they were dealing with. When you built a road, you just went 6 feet off to the side, dug a big hole, and threw it, and there you had your gravel. In another precursor of contemporary debates, NPS officials rejected the BPR's claim that wider and straighter roads were inherently safer, noting that the supposed deficiency of low-standard roads encouraged motorists to speed at slower speeds, and the transparent danger of poorly protected precipices induced ample caution. Higher standard roads promoted higher speeds and a misplaced sense of confidence that could lead to more serious accidents. The NPS and BPR resolved most of their differences in the period from the mid-20s to America's entrance in World War II is generally regarded as the golden age of national park roads, for the balance it achieved in the construction or reconstruction of 100 miles of roadways, including such masterpieces as Going to the Sun Road, Skyline Drive, Blue Ridge Parkway, and Trail Ridge Road. While agency officials were justly proud of these accomplishments and publicly presented the United Front, internal documents revealed pointed conflicts over preservation issues, along with expressions of regret about the impact of improvements on specific features and the park road experience in general. Two of the most significant controversies involved highlights of Yosemite's historic entrance roads. When the BPR inserted that upgrading Wawona Road to accommodate automobile traffic would entail bypassing Inspiration Point, NPS officials mounted strenuous opposition. Albright, Chief Engineer Frank Kittredge, and other senior staff insisted on retaining the iconic view. Frantic efforts to find a feasible alternative failed, however, and Mather endorsed the BPR's proposal. Deciding that the specific viewpoint was not as significant as the suddenly appearing scenic panorama, the two agencies worked together to replicate the sensation by constructing a tunnel at a lower grade that culminated in a similarly striking introduction to Yosemite's stunning scenery. That's a clip from a BPR film about the accomplishment. Having lost the battle over Inspiration Point, Kittredge fought even harder to retain the Big Oak Flat Road's historic alignment with its signature switchback and cathedral-like enfilade of towering trees. Albright and Yosemite Superintendent Charles Goff were equally appalled at the idea of sacrificing the storied approach, but Chief Landscape Architect Tom Vint endorsed the BPR's proposal to forsake the historic route in favor of a more commodious roadway through less scenic terrain. Vint expressed regret that the NPS was, as he said, gradually eliminating all the old-time mountain roads, but insisted traffic concerns and the need to protect the view from the outlook mandated the change. Kittredge's suggestion of preserving the historic road as a downhill route and building a second one-lane road for uphill traffic was rejected on both counts. Goff reluctantly acquiesced, characterizing the loss as the penalty exacted by the commitment to public access, and warning that if utilitarian values were allowed to predominate, the NPS would be savagely criticized not only now but throughout the years by the large and influential and correct elements who oppose engineering parks to death. Contemporary National Register guidelines acknowledge the difficulty of incorporating the concept of feeling in historic integrity evaluations. But by the 1930s, both visitors and NPS officials expressed concerns that the widespread improvements have reduced the romance of park travel, eliminating the sense of adventure encountered on primitive park roads. Kittredge cast his resistance to the BPR's Big Oak Flat Road as an attempt to perpetuate the thrill of the old-time road, while Associate Director Dembre sympathized with a writer's request to leave some roads improved, and longtime Sequoia Superintendent John White shared a visitor's lament that the old roads, or at least some of the advantages of the old roads in the national parks, are no longer to be had. White waged a successful campaign against BPR efforts to replace Sequoia's narrow, winding General's Highway with a wider and straighter roadway that would be easier to drive and accommodate additional traffic. White's resistance has long been cast in environmentalist terms as opposition to replacing the road's 26 switchbacks with a single long loop extending into unsullied regions of the park, but it was motivated at least as much by the desire to preserve the roadway's unique contribution to the park experience. White acknowledged that the road was challenging to drive as it snaked like a brown ribbon toward the park's premier outlook, but maintained that these hallmarks of pre-NPS BPR design were assets rather than liabilities. No matter how good a road we might build up the middle fork, he insisted, it would be a pity to do away with the thrill that people get climbing up the switchback grade and later looking down on it from the Morro Rock. Albright initially embraced the BPR's proposal, but eventually changed his stance, adding an overtly historical dimension. Given the seemingly inexorable march toward higher engineering standards, he observed, the time will soon come when the road, like the switchback sections of general highways, will be extremely unique. Employing a favorite term of his discredited designer George Goodwin, he praised it as a spectacular contribution to the park experience and predicted, people will come to the park to travel over this road because of its interest. The proliferation of park roads, of postcards highlighting the highly visible alignment, suggested the popular opinion accorded with their assessments, though the deification of Going to Sun Road's self-effacing aesthetic has suppressed appreciation for its status as an exemplar of this transitional area of national park road design. White also fought to retain an iconic alignment between towering sequoias that was well below BPR specifications for pavement width and hazard clearance. When his successor succumbed to the pressure to improve circulation, the NPS and BPR collaborated to make a single lane through the stand in a manner that retained the effect of the original arrangement. And I'm going to have to zip through the rest of this really quickly and ad hoc because I bit off more than I can chew. But in Mission 66, what you found was, as again, a lot of things that were presented as attempts to about landscape architecture were actually phrased in terms of preserving the thrill of the old-time Park Road, including the debate over the Tioga Road, which Ethan covered in detail. And Connie Worth was brilliant at playing both sides against each other, the environmentalist versus the BPR to get what he wanted. And then there was also the sense here very much that park roads, that by keeping the historic park roads, you would keep out the riffraff who didn't really belong in the parks and wouldn't put up with park road driving. And there was this park road preservation effort, what were called motor nature trails, saving old roads, and actually probably the first to drive for the thrill, and really one of the first preservation efforts, which was to save the Wawona Covered Bridge. The Chittenden Bridge did not last so well. You can see it was pretty well deteriorated. Hartzog, we talked about, took great pride in his efforts to reduce dependence on the automobile, which came at a time, as Ethan talked about, where society was changing, and the idea that a road could be historic and valuable was not a particularly popular one. And closing parts of Yosemite Valley, jackhammering parking lots, and instituting alternative transportation. Skip over that. And this kind of culminated with the Yosemite General Management Plan, which went on for about 20 years, and culminated in this view, if you want to look at the Leopold view of park roads, these photoshopping out roads to show the advantages of restoring nature and clearing us from our automobile addiction, including removing some National Register bridges. This was fought over time and eliminated. Ironically, Hartzog also presided over the creation of park road standards that were the most park road preservation friendly of all time. And we can't really get them, but they came over debate on whether to preserve this road at the top or to adopt BPR standards. And they created a committee with nobody on the BPR on it, but people like Ansel Adams, out of the theory that, as the chairman of the committee said, park roads are too important to be designed by engineers. And again, we're going to have to skip through this. But then there's this reawakening to the appeal of roads and roadside culture, both popular and academic. And as we talked a little bit with the 50-year rule and all these things that came out of that, and the fact that park roads were deteriorating significantly. They don't meet the AASHTO standards, the road standards. Those kind of things give engineers heart attacks. But engineers became more flexible. They started adopting flexibility. Some of the things like one-lane roads, vehicle restrictions, and also realizing that, like Goodwin and Albright were saying at the beginning, scary roads are safe roads. And also that people, a new bumper sticker, people enjoy the thrill of old-time roads still. And we also collaborated on some ways to do some rehabilitations that met standards, some more preservation friendly than others. Simulated stone is not generally admired, but it's quick and efficient. Then Yellowstone. Yellowstone was really the first one major park to develop a comprehensive road improvement plan, along with what they considered to be historic preservation principles, which were largely about preserving historic structures and maintaining a sense of park roadness. It was a very vague early definition of park roads, what historical significance of park roads was. As a result, a a lot of engineers even think it was overdone. And the safety issue came up again too. I mean, I've hit triple digits there for research purposes. And when you run into charismatic megafauna or tourists, it's a much worse than if you're on a slow road. They'll keep you, narrow road, they'll keep you 20 miles an hour. Glacier is generally considered a much more successful example. It was in terrible shape. There's a lot of collaboration with the FWHA to come up with solutions that were both historic looking and met contemporary standards. But by vehicle size and speed regulations, they were able to keep the semblance of the road. The latest thing we're dealing now is climate change and other ecological issues. And as you can see, you see the results of Tropical Storm Sandy, flooding in Mount Rainier from more catastrophic storms, and the rising sea levels in places like Gulf Islands National Seashore. I just want to get to our last page so we don't miss that. And we also see in Yellowstone another victory of historic. This is a sort of an unholy alliance between engineers and environmentalists, where they moved the historic road, which Chittenden put down there for its picturesque effect. They moved that out of the picturesque river because it was hard to maintain, dangerous, and bad for the river. And they moved it back up into the boring pine forest where Chittenden had taken it out years ago. But to conclude, I just want to again emphasize that it's not simply a matter of preserving historic fabric, that our park roads, sorry, again, I bit off more than I could chew here, that it's a matter of preserving an essential element of the national park experience. And again, as Ethan talked about, a lot of others, it's not necessarily about the physical fabric, it's about the people. This is the way people have enjoyed roads, the park experience. And I'll just leave it at that for now.